I will take it away, Karin.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be sharing some of my recent work on weather and how microplastic contamination might be influencing global carbon cycling. So this is work that is founded in a master's thesis, which was undertaken by Aidan James. He completed his degree at Imperial College London last year under the supervision of myself and Claire Hunt. Let's see, flip. Oh, come on, flip there. Okay. So let's just start with some basic definitions. When I talk about microplastics, these are plastics that are typically categorized being between 0.1 micrometers and 5 millimeters in length. So at the upper end of this range, you could see them with your eyeballs, but towards the lower end of the range, you really need a microscope to be able to see these. These sit in the middle between macroplastics, which would be larger plastic items, and then the nanoplastics, which are super, super small. The microplastics can come from two kinds of sources. Primary sources, so these would be microplastics that are engineered to be small. So this would be like glitter or nurdles. And then we have secondary sources, which would be macroplastics, which have broken down into the microplastic size range. They're widespread in the global ocean and atmosphere, and unfortunately, they seem to be biologically interactive. So here is a schematic of 3 paths that microplastics can take through the base of the ocean food web. So firstly, they're mostly floating or near the surface and where it's warm and there's lots of nutrients, and biofilms can form on them. Biofilms seem to encourage zooplankton to eat these things, and then when the zooplankton eat the microplastics, they poop them out, and then we end up with microplastics packaged in fecal pellets. The other thing about these biofilms is that they're quite sticky, and so this can really encourage their aggregation with organic cells, and these can create these marine snows, which are a combination of organic and microplastics particles and matter, and then they can sink through the water column. So in the 2010s, there were a series of papers that came out of a biological research lab in the UK in which they demonstrated that copepods, which are this tiny ocean predator, eat microplastic beads and poop them out. So they identified a number of concerns with this, including the fact that when the fecal pellets contain low-density microplastic, they don't sink as fast as normal fecal pellets. So here I show some microscopic images. Here's one with a copepod with its guts full of plastic, and you can see the plastics are fluorescent green. And then here's a couple of examples of fecal pellets full of microbeads. Okay, so copepods are like other zooplankton in that they have this really important role in ocean carbon cycling because they eat food full of carbon at the ocean surface, and then they can package that carbon as pellets that then rapidly sink out of the surface layer and then into the deeper ocean. So on the way down, these pellets will break apart and rot and return the carbon to a dissolved form in the seawater. If the pellets sink far enough before they rot, then that carbon can be stored for centuries to thousands of years in the deep ocean. But if the pellets slow down and don't sink as far as before they break apart, then that carbon can be released closer to the ocean surface and get recycled more quickly. It might even end up back in the atmosphere. So this research lab speculated that a slowdown in fecal pellet sinking by plastic contamination, if it's happening all around the world, this could slow down the export of carbon to the deep ocean, and then that could feed back on atmospheric CO2 concentrations and therefore make climate change worse. Well, that sounds really terrible. And there was a research team that included this concern in a review into microplastics in 2020. Since then, it's been cited 156 times and in increasingly credible fora. So Science had a review that came out last year that cited this concern. The UNEP plastic science document, which was intended to help inform negotiations 2 weeks ago in Uruguay, If you read that document, they have this concern listed here where plastic pollution can alter global carbon cycling through its effect on plankton and primary production and marine systems, blah, 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 affect the marine biological pump and the ocean carbon stock. Oh, come on, it's not flipping. Let's see. Okay, so I'm a biogeochemical modeler and I specialize in ocean ecosystems and their impact on global nutrient and carbon cycles in the climate. So when I see claims like widespread plastic pollution is going to make climate change worse by reducing particle fluxes and stopping up the biological carbon pump, I get interested. But I also get a little bit frustrated because the climate science community has known for 40 years that organic particle sinking rates in the ocean do not predict atmospheric CO2 or ocean carbon storage. Excuse me. So I show here two examples. This one is from a paper that came out in 2008, and this one compares different climate models, steady state export production. So that's the organic particle fluxes to the corresponding atmospheric CO2. So in general, more export production is associated with more carbon in the atmosphere, not less, but it's not a simple relationship. Likewise on the right here, so I'm showing a figure that came from a very recent paper which compared the climate and ocean response for a whole bunch of Earth system models. So what you can see for ocean carbon storage is that it's increasing in all of the models over the historical period into the future. But at the same time, export production, so that's the particle fluxes, these are generally decreasing. So a loss of zooplankton pellet flux to the deep ocean is not going to decrease ocean carbon storage and disrupt our climate commitments. I also want to point out in this right side figure that the quantities of change in export production are around 0.5 petagram of carbon to the year 2100. But when you're looking at change in the carbon storage of the ocean, this is more like 20 petagrams of carbon or even more. So organic particle fluxes are only a very, very small part of the ocean carbon cycle response to climate change. Okay, so slowing the zooplankton fecal pellets by microplastic contamination is not going to significantly affect ocean carbon cycling, but this idea is circulating. So I decided to look into it quantitatively using modeling. And as it happened, there was a student at Imperial College London who was looking for a master's thesis. So Aidan James did a lot of this preliminary work, and we've just submitted this to Frontiers in Marine Science. So once that's published, if it's accepted, it will go in open source and be publicly available. But I work with the University of Victoria Earth System Climate Model. So this is a model with a really simple representation of the atmosphere, but it has a fairly complex ocean model. It has sea ice, it has marine sediments, it also has land carbon processes that are represented. And it has this really complex ocean ecosystem to which I've added microplastics. So Aidan and I coded in this change to the fecal pellet sinking rate based on the lab experiments that were published by that in that Kvale et al. Paper that I showed earlier. So this is increasing amounts of low density microplastic is going to cause the fecal pellets to sink more slowly. So we assume that all of the microplastic in the model is low density and all of it's causing the pellets to slow down. The default pellet sinking speed is shown as the linearly increasing straight line here. Sinking rate with, so the sinking rate here is on the x-axis and then increasing ocean depth on the y. So this is the default model fecal pellet sinking rate. And then when we add microplastic, then this causes the pellets to sink more slowly. So slowing down, keep adding more and more plastic will make them sink more and more slowly. Okay, so after we coded this slowing effect on the fecal pellets, we then forced the model with a rapid increase in atmospheric CO2, which follows the historical record and then projects that into the future to the year 2100. And then we also forced the model with rapidly increasing microplastic pollution rates that roughly agree with literature estimates. The microplastic pollution is starting in 1950 and it ramps up to 2100. But because there's a lot of uncertainty about how much microplastic is actually entering the ocean and how that might change in the future, we just apply a range of microplastic pollution rates, as well as slightly different parameter values for the model. And we just run the model a bunch of times to get a range in model responses. This is a pretty typical strategy for dealing with uncertainties in climate modeling. So you just get together a whole bunch of models, you run them all with the same forcing, and then average the responses to understand generally what might happen. Okay, so when I show these plots, these are not results from a single model, but from many model runs where the responses are averaged together to give a model ensemble mean. Okay, so I'm showing here differences between models which include slowed fecal pellet sinking and those that don't at the year 2100, so way in the future. Now, the blue color indicates reduced particle fluxes, but the red color is enhanced particle fluxes. So what you can see here looking at the pellet plot is that in places like the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, the Western Tropical Pacific, and the Eastern Tropical Pacific, fecal pellet fluxes are reduced by slowed pellet sinking. But in many places like the Central Tropical Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Southern Ocean, the fluxes are actually enhanced by the slowed pellet sinking. So what that means is that simple take experiments on individuals that show a certain effect, excuse me, like slowed pellet sinking for microplastic contamination, can't be accurately extrapolated to the whole Earth system. And this is because the ecosystems respond to whatever's happening to those individuals. So in this case, the slowdown of the fecal pellets releases not just carbon, but also nutrients higher in the water column. So phytoplankton love nutrients, and this stimulates their growth. So we end up with generally larger particle fluxes from the phytoplankton, shown here in this middle plot, when the pellet sinking slows down. So this means an overall increase in the total organic particle flux when fecal pellet sinking is slowed down by plastic. Okay, so the ecosystem changes that are brought about by the slowing down of fecal pellet sinking reduce the strength of the biological carbon pump by about 1% by the year 2100. So we can estimate this from something that's called apparent oxygen utilization, which is a measure of how much oxygen is consumed in the ocean by the rotting of organic material. So I'm showing here globally averaged AOU plots on the top and the bottom, both at the year 2100. So these plots are showing increasing depth on the y-axis, and then they run from the South Pole to the North Pole on the x-axis. So this top plot, we see the ensemble mean AOU values in the simulations that include slowed pellet sinking. So it's the pink shading. And then the bottom plot, we see the AOU values in a model that only includes climate change. So just to say that the colors look basically the same between these two plots. Okay, so now I've overlaid here difference contours. So the slowed pellet sinking reduces AOU by about 1 to 2 millimoles per cubic meter at depth in the deeper levels. But it actually ends up increasing AOU by several millimoles per cubic meter in the upper ocean. Excuse me, but by contrast, climate warming increases AOU by more than 10 millimoles per cubic meter over most of the deep ocean on global average. So there's also a net effect on air-sea gas exchange, but it happens to be really, really small. So we see a decrease globally of 0.024% by the year 2100. And this is just really negligible compared to the massive carbon imprint coming from fossil fuel burning. So just to demonstrate with our model that microplastic slowing of fecal pellets is not going to threaten our climate commitments. But you can think about this a different way, which is that it indicates that the major threat to climate for plastics is not the plastic in the ocean, it's the carbon emissions associated with its production. Okay, so I also want to put the particle flux responses into context against climate change. So These plots are showing changes to particle fluxes between 1950 and 2100 due only to climate warming. So the model simulates generally a large global loss of organic particle sinking in all of the particle types, excuse me, due to a warming up and slowing down of the ocean circulation between 1950 and 2100, except for the Arctic and the Southern Ocean. And that's because we lose sea ice, and that actually means a lot more phytoplankton can grow there in the future than is possible now. The impact on the particle sinking of slowing fecal pellets generally acts against the climate change trend, because if you can think back a couple of slides, those were mostly in the red colors, so an enhancement of the particle fluxing, but here we see mostly blues. So what we see is actually a mitigation of the climate change impact. Okay, so we find a global mitigation impact on organic particle flux changes at the year 2100 of around 28% of the climate change impact. That's actually pretty significant, but that's also not to say that microplastic contamination is going to lessen the overall effects of climate warming. So that would be a totally wrong interpretation, because there are other major changes occurring in the nutrient and the oxygen cycling. So like we get this rapid acceleration of ocean deoxygenation from the microplastics. But it is to say that the effects of microplastic in the marine environment are going to work both with and against the impacts of climate change. But given the large uncertainties in this model, and there's uncertainties about the future, it's not uncommon for myself, as well as others working in this space, to hear, so what? I mean, compared to climate change, plastics are just not important. So, excuse me, the same logic came up decades ago in the context of climate warming. So greenhouse gases were discovered in variable concentrations in the atmosphere. CO2 is one of the most abundant, and it has a really long lifetime in the atmosphere. But there are others that are shorter lived and with lower concentrations, but they're a lot more potent. So like methane or nitrous oxide, or especially the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, and the hydrochlorofluorocarbons, HCFCs. So scientists needed a way to describe the total impact of all of these gases on climate, and they also needed a way to compare the relative impacts. So they adopted frameworks like global warming potentials, which just make it easier to compare the impact of different gases on climate. So global warming potential is the amount of heat absorbed by any greenhouse gas in the atmosphere as a multiple of the heat which would be absorbed by the same mass of CO2. So CO2 has a global warming potential of 1, and HCFCs, which are ozone depleters, but they are also extremely potent greenhouse gases, they have a global warming potential of around 2,000. So HCFCs were supposed to be phased out globally under the Montreal Protocol because of their ozone depletion potential, but their phase out was actually accelerated due to their recognized strong global warming potential, despite them having a very small concentration in the atmosphere. So I can take a similar approach with microplastics because, like CO2, they are mostly composed of carbon. So what I do here is I calculate what I'm calling an ecosystem impact potential, where I'm comparing the effects of microplastics carbon on the ocean particle fluxes, okay, shown here in the top row, to the effects of fossil emissions carbon on ocean particle fluxes, shown here in the bottom row, over the same time period. So between 1950 and 2100, the model simulates 0.012 petagrams of carbon released to the ocean as microplastics. Over the same time period, we have emitted 1,874 petagrams of carbon released to the atmosphere as CO2 from fossil fuels. So this is a really crude approach because some of the change in particle fluxes happening due to climate warming is due to warming that occurred before 1950, and changes to the warming will continue beyond the year 2100. But it's a good place to start in providing some perspective on ecosystem impacts from plastics and allowing for comparison to climate impacts on ecosystems over a 150-year time frame. Okay, so at 2100, we are looking at changes in particle fluxes to the order of tens to hundreds of grams of carbon per square meter per year per petagram of carbon released as plastic. Okay, so climate change impacts are more than 1,000 times weaker. Looking down here, something like tenths to hundreds of grams of carbon per meter square per year per petagram of carbon as fossil fuel emissions. So what this demonstrates is that ocean microplastics, despite having little impact on ocean carbon cycling, having a low concentration, and a smaller total impact on ocean ecosystems, and climate warming is a more potent disruptor of ecosystem function, at least over the 150 years we simulated. And I think using this kind of analysis is potentially really useful in the policy space, because we have this large body of literature that already exists about tolerable and intolerable thresholds of climate impacts on the Earth system, including ecosystems. But currently we have very little information for microplastics impacts on ecosystems. So just to summarize some of the takeaway points, microplastics load fecal pellet sinking ends up increasing the total particle fluxes and has a negligible impact on climate, which means that the major threat to climate from plastics is the associated carbon emissions. Microplastics load fecal pellet sinking may mitigate climate change impact on the global organic particle fluxes by around 28% by the year 2100. But the climate change impacts are 1,000 times weaker than microplastic impacts on ecosystems if you consider it by a carbon mass framework at century scale. So to me, this suggests the need for a massive refocus of mitigation efforts and really actively looking into the microplastics impacts. Okay, so I'll stop with that. And I put the faces back up and take questions.
Kia ora, Karin, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions for Karin as well? If you're on the Zoom, put your questions in the chat as well.
Just so you can see us here, Karin.
Sort of. You're all in the far distant background. That's okay.
Oh, so we've got a question from Jackie.
Clear, like looking at the microplastic space in 2013, also adopted by researchers. Their conclusions, they're saying all of the microplastics freshwater. They're finding that all the freshwater samples contain microplastics. So the conclusion to your study was hazardous waste designation for plastic. And do you think, looking at the summary and seeing how this is really critical, what are your thoughts on that designation for plastic waste?
Cool. Okay, so Jackie's question was following previous research from Chelsea Rockman. So a few years ago, they were looking at freshwater microplastics, and they classified them as hazardous materials. Yes. Okay. Just so hard to remember. So their conclusion was that they would classify microplastics as hazardous materials, recommended as hazardous materials, as hazardous waste.
Yeah.
It's December. So what do you think about this recommendation in terms of your work?
I see this coming up with this this is actively debated, right, with scientists is can we get these classified as hazardous materials? And my understanding is this is based on physiological impacts on individuals, which is all well and good. I think that, if they're hazardous, and they should be labeled as such. But when it comes to impacts on ecosystems, oftentimes these classifications tend to fall apart because at a ecosystem level, the impacts are not readily apparent. They're not observable. In which case, I think if you're looking at, whole ocean basins and at global scale, we need to have a different kind of labeling.
Any other questions for Karin? I have a question. Do you think you can try the model with different sizes, shapes, and different densities of plastic as well, or is that just going to include too many different parameters that it's just going to explode? Do you think that could be done maybe?
Absolutely. Somebody come and work with me. I'll put a student on it.
There we go.
It's a lot of work.
It is. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much. No other. Oh, we've got a question. Laurent's got one.
So, what do you think you can verify one of the skills and mission?
Cool. So Laurent asked, how would you be able to verify your model compared to like field observations? So maybe some of that previous. Yeah, what kind of field observations could you include?
Well, this is the same problem that plagues climate researchers too, because we can make all kinds of predictions as to how the ecosystems are going to respond to climate. And actually verifying any of that is really difficult. But it is possible because, we have measurements of things like temperature and light. But with microplastics, we don't have enough data to be able to verify these things in the open ocean yet. I think we would need a lot more data about microplastics and how they're actively moving through the system.
Is it quite like region specific as well, determining like different climates, like water temperatures, and maybe what kind of different plastics they get, like compared to how we've heard this morning about like Pacific Island countries who might be inundated with plastics, so and like different ecosystems. So I suppose it'd be quite hard actually to model with different areas.
Yeah, super difficult. I mean, the different kinds of plastics, I mean, they're finding, the buoyancy matters. And so in some parts of the water column, you'll have one kind of plastic, and then deeper in the water column, you have a different kind of plastic. And then whatever happens to be living in those different locations, you could have a different net response ecologically. So.
Cool. No, awesome work, Karin. We really enjoy your research. Oh, wait, we've got one more.
I'm really super interested to ask this question, but
It's like the faecal pellets. So yeah. Cool. So we've got a question from Karin. So she asked if you took into consideration like the toxicity of the microplastics inside the faecal pellets as well.
No, not yet. I think at some point I will with a student. Come and work with me.
You got unlimited opportunities here, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. I mean, this field is really in its infancy, so more to be done than has been done.
Okay. Got one from Tristia. Oh, and Ursula.
Thanks for that, Karin. I was really glad to have the opportunity to share your research at the IMC as well. It's received with great interest, so you might get some phone calls. My question was around drawing together the complexity of your research, climate change, for instance, potentially around chemicals waste, and around biodiversity loss. So my question is around how do you see international policy responding to the kind of complex research you're producing in a way that joins the dots between different multilateral environmental agreements and discussions at global and national.
Do you mind coming up here? Just stand here.
Karin, thanks for that. I was just saying that I just shared your research at IMC as well, so I'm really pleased Which camera am I looking at? Am I?
Just
Okay.
like top here.
Oh, okay.
I can barely hear you.
All right.
Just
That's
stand
okay.
here.
Good to hear and look at it.
Can you really
Okay.
push it? Yeah.
My question just really basically is your research, as many of ours, is really complex, and it crosses across lots of different ecosystems and lots of different complex global and local issues. So, I mean, obviously yours cuts across climate change, biodiversity loss, potentially toxicity and waste, obviously microplastics. So my question essentially is this: how do you see your research impacting multiple environmental agreements at once? I mean, we're talking here about science policy now.
I don't know. I don't know anything about policy. I think I put the information out there and I hope that it's usable.
Yeah,
I
just
don't know.
saying we recognise how important your research is, so it has to have impact. So I think we should have a discussion about how to ensure that your research cuts across, not just yours, but others in APRA as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, she's talking about what's what is the
Yeah, so following on from Tricia's question, Ursula has a question. If you were talking to a key policymaker in New Zealand, what would be like the one take-home message that you would like them to pick up on from your
We'll sign up for the plastics treaty, in the strongest possible terms. Yeah, I mean, we've got to stop this stuff from getting into the ocean and into our lungs and into the atmosphere. I mean, this is really a massive problem.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karin.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to listen to the next one.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. So next we've got